Kia ora, good morning everyone, Rich Wong here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we have the Panasonic Lumix 2260 lens for the L-mount system. This is one of the first more compact full-frame lens from Panasonic, and there are some pretty interesting design about this lens. But before we go and talk more about the design or the image quality, I just want to come out here and take some photo using this lens because it's such a beautiful day today, and I just want to see how this lens would perform in real life. So let's go and take some photos first, and then we will go back to my home and talk more about the design and the image quality. Okay, welcome back to my home, and I hope you like the photo that I shot with this Lumix 2260 lens. Now, there are many things that I want to talk about in this video, so let's get started. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about is the focal length of this lens. If you have been doing photography for a while, you may remember quite a long time ago, the standard zoom lens, the wide end was quite a bit not as wide as the zoom lens, standard zoom lens these days. Some of the older standard zoom lens start from maybe 35, there's a 35-70, and then later on it changed to 28 to maybe 70, and these days most of the standard zoom lens is from 24 to 70. But with this Lumix lens, it starts from 20, which is quite a bit wider, and that is quite interesting. If you think, oh, this is only 20mm, so compared to the 24, it's only 4mm difference, so maybe not that much. That's not really the case, because on the wide angle end, each millimeter focal length, there is quite a bit different. So a 4mm difference is quite a bit. So have a look at these two photos. This photo was shot at 24mm, and then look at the other one. This was shot at the exact same place, but at 20mm. So look at it side by side, you can see there is quite a bit difference between the 24mm and 20mm. And I really like that, because the extra 4mm on the wide end actually make quite a bit of difference, and there are some advantage that I'm going to talk about a little bit later on in this video. And then on the telephoto end, this lens can only go up to 60, which if you compare to the typical 24-70, that is 10mm shorter. If you look at these two side by side photos, you can also see that 60mm is quite a bit shorter than 70mm. Now you may wonder why Panasonic doesn't just make it a 20 to 70, isn't that would be better? You got a bit wider, but then you don't lose any on the telephoto end. And the reason, I guess, is pretty simple, because they want to keep the size of this lens as compact as possible. So make it a more compact lens compared to the other kit lens that they have right now, which is the 24-105 f4 lens. So if you look at these two lenses side by side, you can see the new 2260 lens is quite a bit smaller than this 24-105 f4 lens, which is not really a huge lens, but putting it side by side, you can definitely see the size difference. And not only it is a smaller lens, the weight of this lens is also quite lightweight lens. This is only 350 grams. Definitely is one of the lightest full frame kit lens in the market. When the lens is at the 20mm focal length, the size of the lens is the smallest. Once you start to zoom in, and then the lens would extend a bit, the length of the lens is the longest when you fully zoom in at 60mm focal length. Compared to the other Panasonic lenses in the market, the other S or S Pro lenses, this 20-60mm lens definitely feel a little bit more plasticky, maybe partially because of the weight of this lens is also quite a bit lighter. But despite it feel a little bit plasticky, it is still dust-proof and also weatherproof. I have used this lens under the rain quite a bit over the last few days, especially when I was doing the continuous autofocus test. I was using the lens under rain for probably at least 20 to 30 minutes continuously. I just have the lens mount on the S1H in the backyard and just without any cover, and it was raining, and after 20-30 minutes everything is still okay, so no problem at all if you want to use this lens under a bit of wet weather condition. This 20-60mm lens is the first Lumix zoom lens that doesn't have a constant maximum aperture. At the wide end, the maximum aperture is f3.5, and then at the telephoto end is f5.6. Now check out this screen capture that I got, that I show you how the maximum aperture value change when I change the focal length. You can see that as soon as I try to zoom in, the maximum aperture would start to, the value would start to increase, which means the size start to drop immediately when I try to zoom in a little bit. But then the good thing is the value seems to increase linearly all the way to the maximum focal length, compared to some other lenses where the maximum aperture value would drop very quickly even before you reach the maximum focal length. This Lumix 20-60 lens does quite a bit better. The lens doesn't have any aperture ring on it, so if you want to change the aperture, you have to use the dial on your camera. And when I'm shooting video and changing the aperture transition happens relatively smoothly. Autofocus performance and the speed is very good and very fast when I'm taking photo in AFS mode, especially when I'm shooting under bright lighting condition. However, because the maximum aperture of the lens is not the fastest, especially at the telephoto end, so when you are shooting in a darker environment, you may notice the autofocus performance may drop a bit. The autofocus operation is also pretty quiet and pretty smooth, which makes this lens also very suitable for video. And I have done a bit of continuous autofocus test with the face tracking, and the overall performance seems to be pretty well, as I have found out in my previous autofocus test when testing the S1 and S1H. The continuous autofocus performance when shooting video improve when you are shooting in a higher frame rate. So if you want to have the best continuous autofocus performance when shooting video, try to shoot at the higher frame rate at 50 or 60 frames per second, or if you are shooting with a S1H, shoot at even higher frame rate, and that can give you the best continuous autofocus performance. I have done a bit of testing, and it seems like this lens is a parfocal lens or very close to a parfocal lens. If you want to do a bit of vlogging with your S1 or S1H, previously the best lens would be the Lumix S 24-105 f4 lens, which is okay for doing vlogging, but this 20-60 lens is definitely a much better lens for vlogging. The 20mm focal length at the wide end means it can capture quite a bit wider field of view, and that means you can capture quite a bit more background, and also your face won't be filling up the whole frame when you are doing vlogging and shooting yourself. And also because of the wider field of view, you don't have to fully extend your arm so much, and also the weight of this lens is quite a bit lighter than the 24-105 f4. So combining these two together, it means holding your camera for longer is a lot easier when shooting with this 20-60 lens compared to the 24-105. However, on the downside, because this lens doesn't have the optical image stabilizer compared to the 24-105, which has optical image stabilizer, which means it can benefit from the dual IS. So if you compare the footage that I shot using this two lenses, you can see the footage from the 20-60 is a little bit more shaky in comparison. But if you ask me to choose between these two, I would definitely still go for the 20-60 lens. And speaking of image stabilization, I also did a bit of testing to see how is it different when you compare this 20-60 lens, which doesn't have the optical image stabilizer, compared to the 24-105 lens, which can use the dual IS. So I shot about 600 photos at 60mm focal length at different shutter speed using these two lenses, and this is the result I got. While I definitely can see that the 24-105 with the dual IS is more effective in minimizing vibration compared to the 20-60 lens, which only rely on the camera's in-body image stabilizer, but the difference is not really that big. From my results, it seems like the difference is only around half a stop or so. In terms of focus briefing, when I'm shooting at the wide and 20mm, there really isn't much focus briefing that is noticeable even when I'm changing the focus distance from the very close to infinity. However, when I start to zoom in and increase the focal length, the focus briefing become a little bit more noticeable. If you look at this video footage that I shot at 60mm focal length, you can see a little bit of focus briefing. Okay, now let's have a look at the image quality, and I'm going to do some comparison with the Lumix S 24-105 f4 lens so that we can see how does this 20-60 lens performs when you compare it with the other kit lens for the Lumix S cameras. First, let's look at the image sharpness. At 20mm focal length, the center sharpness is already very good at the maximum aperture. Even when you zoom in and look at it at 200%, the center sharpness is still very good. And now if we look at the corner sharpness is also very good even at the maximum aperture at f3.5. If you stop down a little bit to f4, then the corner sharpness becomes excellent as well. Okay, now let's look at the image sharpness at 24mm so that I can compare it with the 24-105 f4 lens. Look at the center. At f4, the 20-60mm lens is pretty good. The center sharpness is pretty good, but if you compare it with the 24-105 lens, I would say the 24-105 lens is slightly sharper at f4 aperture setting. When you stop down to f5.6, the center sharpness of the 20-60 lens become excellent. And now let's look at the corner. With the 20-60 lens, at the maximum aperture to around f4, the corner sharpness is okay, but if you stop down to f5.6, then the corner become pretty sharp. Compare it with the 24-105 lens, I say the 24-105 lens is a little bit sharper at the corner at f4 aperture setting, but when you stop down to f5.6, then the corner sharpness from these two lenses are very similar. I may even say the 20-60 lens is slightly sharper at f5.6 if you compare the corner sharpness. Okay, now let's look at the results at 60mm focal length. At 60mm focal length, the maximum aperture with this 20-60 lens is now f5.6, and at this aperture setting, the center sharpness is decent with this lens, but if you compare it with the 24-105 lens, the 24-105 center sharpness is definitely quite a bit better than the 20-60. I would even say this lens at f4 setting is slightly sharper than the 20-60 lens at f5.6. Stop down the 20-60 lens to f8 would improve the center sharpness quite a bit, and that seems to be the best aperture setting if you want to maximize the center sharpness. Corners at f5.6 is a little bit soft. It's definitely very usable, but if you want to improve the corner sharpness, I think once again, stop down to f8 would give you the best result. Compare it with the 24-105 lens, I think the 24-105 lens corner performance is a little bit sharper if you compare to the 20-60 lens. Chromatic aberration is very well controlled by this 20-60 lens. When I go through all my sample photos, even some of those that with very high contrast, I see very minimal amount of color fringing. Unless you are shooting some close-up photos, you probably wouldn't be able to dissolve the background into bokeh. But when you do that, the quality of the bokeh, I probably wouldn't rave about it, but it's also not terrible either. Distortion is also very well controlled. I don't really know whether the camera has some hidden distortion compensation that applied by the camera or not, but when I go through all the videos and photos, including the raw photo that I shot with this lens, the only small amount of distortion I can see is a bit of pincushion distortion at 20mm focal length, but once I start to zoom in, then I virtually don't see any distortion anymore. If you like having sunstars in your photos, you can stop down the lens to between f16 to f22 and then you can have some beautiful sunstar in your photos. Compare the sunstar from the 2060 lens to the 24-105 lens. I think I like the sunstar from the 20-60 lens a bit more because the sunstar look a little bit sharper and just look a little bit more beautiful compared to the 24-105 lens. In terms of vignetting, when shooting at the wide end 20mm, there is a small amount of vignetting when shooting at the maximum aperture f3.5 to around f4, but once I stop down to f5.6, then vignetting is virtually not noticeable. When shooting at the telephoto and even at the maximum aperture f5.6, vignetting is not really noticeable. And when compared with the 24-105 lens, at the wide end, the 24-105 lens actually has a little bit more vignetting at the maximum aperture. When shooting at 16mm focal length, vignetting is very similar between these two lenses. Lens flare control is very decent with this 2060 lens. There could be a bit of ghosting though, but that only seems to happen when you directly shooting into a very bright light source. This 20-60mm lens can focus as close as 15 cm when you are shooting at the wide end, and that can give you the maximum magnification of 0.43 times when you are shooting at 26mm focal length. So while it's not exactly a 1-to-1 macro magnification, it is still good enough for you to take some very nice close-up photos. And the good thing is, even when you are shooting at the minimum focus distance, the image sharpness is still very good even if you are shooting at the maximum aperture. However, it still has the same problem that when you are trying to take some close-up photo at the wide angle end, your camera lens will get very close to the subject. That means you can easily cast some shadow onto your subject. So two things. First is you definitely have to remove the lens hood. Oh yes, there's a lens hood that comes with the lens. A very nice one. It clicks onto it very nicely and securely, and it should also give you some pretty good flare resistant protection, also physical protection to the lens. But if you are taking close-up photos, definitely you should remove this lens hood, otherwise the lens hood could cast some shadow to your subject. And also you just have to pay attention to the ambient light and just make sure you don't get into the way where the light comes from if you want to minimize the amount of shadow that you can cast onto your subject. After using this lens for about a solid week, including taking a lot of real-world photo and videos and then do a lot of testing here in my home, I don't really find any major weakness about this lens. And if you consider the price and the size and also the special focal length of this lens, I would probably say this is one of the best, if not the best, kit lens in the market right now. The only thing that I really don't like is more plasticky construction. It does feel more plasticky compared to the other Lumix S or S Pro lens from Panasonic. But at the same time, I think consider this is more a kit lens, so I think the build quality, even though a bit plasticky, is still acceptable. When the lens was announced last week, I was reading different forum and website, and I saw some people saying, oh, why Panasonic release such a boring lens like this? Why not release another lens, this lens or that lens? So that's something that I don't really agree. While I definitely also want to see some other lenses, for example, there are a few f1.8 prime lens that is already announced. I'm very looking forward to see that and try those lenses, but I think this is also a very important lens for the Lumix S and also the L mount system in general. compared to the typical 24-70 focal length for the other standard zoom lens in the market, the 20-60 is definitely a lot more interesting. I found that when I'm shooting with a standard 24-70 zoom lens, quite often I would just shoot at the widest and 24mm, and also quite often I feel like I want to go a little bit wider. And what that means is usually that means I have to carry another ultra wide angle lens, or that means I have to buy another ultra wide angle lens first and then carry it. So that means I have to carry two lenses just because quite often I want to shoot a little bit wider than 24mm. But with this 20-60 lens, that extra 4mm wider, it does allow me to capture quite a bit wider than the standard zoom lens, and that means I probably don't need to carry a ultra wide angle lens anymore, and that is a very good thing. If you currently have a 24-70 lens in your camera bag or had one in the past, have a look at the photos that you shot with that lens. Look at the EXIF data, look at the focal length. If you find that a lot of your photos actually capture at 24mm focal length, it is an indication that you just love to shoot wide angle photos, and the chances are you actually want to go a little bit wider, but the fact that it's a 24-70 lens means you cannot shoot wider than that. And if you find you're exactly like that, then this 20-60 lens might be the better lens for you compared to a more normal 24-70 lens. And another reason why I think this lens is very important is that after last year, Panasonic released the professional S1, S1R and S1H camera. Now, this lens, a much smaller and more affordable lens, is a sign, it's a symbol that they are now starting to look into the consumer market as well for the L-mount camera system. If they are going to release a smaller or more consumer-oriented camera, the 24-105 f4 lens would be too big a kit lens for a smaller camera. So they have to come out with something a little bit smaller, and this lens is exactly the lens that they can put on when they release a smaller full frame camera. And I just want to clarify that Panasonic has not told me that they are going to release a smaller camera anytime soon. It's just all my thinking, but I feel this seems to completely make sense.